Some of your parents shouldn't be parents. That was the belief of notorious scientist Francis Galton. You know, the guy who said that everyone has an independent, unique set of fingerprints. He was technically wrong about that, by the way. Eugenics, the idea that we can improve the human population through controlled breeding for desirable traits, was a fairly straightforward extrapolation of the ideas put forth by Galton's second cousin, Charles Darwin. Some people are just downright superior to others. For agriculture and livestock, we can intentionally facilitate breeding to select for desirable traits. Or similarly, we could selectively prevent the future generations of stock from having less desirable traits. So then, why couldn't we do the same things for humankind? Francis Galton promoted the concept in the 1880s, and by the early 20th century, books like The Passing of the Great Race by Madison Grant had widely popularized the idea, particularly in the United States and Europe.
That's not something to be proud of.
It is something to be proud of, and you created nothing but barbarism. You're the fucking barbarians. You destroyed the treasures of mankind. What the fuck do you know about civilization? What the fuck do you know about pride? What the fuck do you have to be proud of, except looting, genociding, and destroying the cultures and peoples and wealth of this world?
Grant's work was so influential that even former President Theodore Roosevelt praised Grant in their correspondences, showing some support for ideas of selective breeding and birth control for the unfit. Unfortunately for his legacy, Roosevelt felt concerned about the higher birth rates among less desirable populations and felt that it would lead to the decline of better segments of society, likening the phenomenon to racial suicide. Yikes. Despite this, Roosevelt did not explicitly support some of the more extreme measures promoted by men like Galton and Grant. However, Galton and Grant's ideas didn't simply end with Roosevelt, who was already several years into his post-presidency retirement. Albert Johnson, a U.S. congressman and the leading advocate for restrictive immigration policies, was heavily influenced by Grant's arguments and played a key role in the passage of the Immigration Act of 1924. Similarly, the Reich Citizenship Law of 1935 in Nazi Germany defined who could be considered a citizen of the Reich as individuals of German or related blood, in an attempt to exclude Jews and non-Aryans from citizenship. The law also restricted the rights of non-Aryans, making it difficult for them to immigrate or remain in Germany. Several U.S. states enacted laws prohibiting marriage between individuals with disabilities or those considered feeble-minded. These laws aimed to prevent the birth of children deemed genetically unfit. These laws were implemented mostly on the state level rather than immigration laws, which were federal. Marriage restrictions began popping up in around 20 states from 1896 to 1915, beginning with Connecticut. Although some would argue that eugenic laws have existed on racial lines since 1691 with the implementation of the Virginia Slave Codes. Others still would argue that the prototypes for these racial miscegenation laws were set by Maryland and Virginia as early as the 1660s. In Nazi Germany, the Nuremberg Laws of 1935 included prohibitions on marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews, a practice rooted in eugenic beliefs about racial purity. However, marriage laws were not the end of the eugenic movement's political ambitions. In 1924, Harry Laughlin from Oskaloosa, Iowa, an influential eugenicist, cited Grant's work as supporting evidence as he worked bipartisanly with U.S. policymakers to create the Model Sterilization Law, targeting the feeble-minded, insane, epileptic, alcoholic, blind, deaf, deformed, and poor. Indiana passed the first eugenics-based compulsory sterilization law in 1907, though nearly 30 US states followed suit, with even Indiana adapting to Laughlin's model. Although the Indiana law was overturned in 1921 by the Indiana Supreme Court. However, what happened in Virginia changed the precedent for everyone. The highest court in the land, the Supreme Court, ruled in the Buck v. Bell case that the Virginia Sterilization Act of 1924 was constitutional. Hence, Harry Laughlin's model became the American norm. Between the early 1900s and the 1970s, approximately 60,000 people were forcibly sterilized under state eugenics laws. California was particularly notorious, conducting approximately 1/3 of all sterilizations in the US. Under the Nazi regime, the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring in 1933 led to the forced sterilization of around 400,000 people deemed unfit. However, these sorts of eugenic laws were not limited to America and Nazi Germany. Between 1934 and 1976, the Swedish government implemented a eugenic sterilization program targeting individuals with mental illness, disabilities, and those deemed socially undesirable. An estimated 63,000 people were sterilized. Additionally, European colonial regimes, particularly in German Southwest Africa, now Namibia, implemented racial policies that included forced sterilization. The infamous case of Eugen Fischer's experiments on the Herero and Nama people involved sterilization and other human rights abuses under the guise of racial science. While contentious in the US, these eugenic laws were not simply concocted by evil politicians. According to Molly Ladd Taylor, a professor of history at York University, in her article on eugenic sterilization, the callous treatment of people classified as feeble-minded was not only something that eugenics experts and the state imposed. Judges and police used eugenic laws to control perceived troublemakers. Psychologists and social workers identified the feeble-minded to enhance their professional standing. Taxpayers clamored for eugenic legislation to lower welfare spending. Parents were ashamed by the stigma of illegitimacy and consented to sterilize their daughters. Married women let themselves be designated feeble-minded so they could obtain a legal sterilization when contraception was out of reach. However, in modern times, the public perception of eugenics has soured significantly, largely due to its associations with the atrocities committed by Nazi Germany, despite the fact that the Nazi eugenics were in part inspired by American ideas and policies surrounding eugenics.
Present some egghead scientific argument based on fact? I'm just a regular dude. I like to drink beer. Right, Charlie? He's got a point.
No, he doesn't.
What? See, Charlie? These liberals are trying to assassinate my character. I can't change their mind. I won't change my mind, because I don't have to, because I'm an American. I won't change my mind on anything, regardless of the facts that are set out before me. I'm dug in, and I'll never change.
Mac, look, you're wasting our time.
And why is that?
Because the smartest scientists in the entire world all agree.
I'm glad you brought that up. Because, Mr. Reynolds, science is a liar sometimes.
Oh, boy.
This is Aristotle, thought to be the smartest man on the planet. He believed that the Earth was the center of the universe, and everybody believed him because he was so smart. Until another smartest guy came around, Galileo, and he disproved that theory, making Aristotle and everybody else on Earth look like a bitch. Of course, Galileo then thought comets were an optical illusion, and there's no way that the moon could cause the ocean's tides. Everybody believed that because he was so smart. He was also wrong, making him and everyone else on Earth look like a bitch again. And then, best of all, Sir Isaac Newton gets born and blows everybody's nips off with his big brains. Of course, he also thought he could turn metal into gold and died eating mercury, making him yet another stupid bitch.
bitch!
No.
Mr. Reynolds, these were all the smartest scientists on the planet. Only problem is, they kept being wrong. Sometimes.
Oh, this is insane, you fool! There are volumes of proven data. Numbers, figures.
I guess I'll concede. Oh, wait, one more thing before I do, Mr. Reynolds. Have you poured through the data yourself? The numbers, the figures?
Well, no. No.
Oh, interesting. So let me get this straight, Mr. Reynolds. You get your information from a book written by men you've never met. And you take their words as truth, based on a willingness to believe, a desire to accept, a leap of, dare I say it, faith?
Come on. Look, I don't even know how I'm supposed to respond to that. Like, come on. That's a false equivalency.
Just answer the question, Mr. Reynolds.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
I rest my case.
Oh, that got me. Yeah.
Eugenics is often criticized scientifically by having historians and scientists alike go through and nitpick specific claims that were crudely constructed or otherwise provably false. But this is a fool's errand. The validity of any scientific theory does not rest upon the individual specific claims of specific individual scientists. For example, just because quantum physicists may make some wrong predictions about quantum physics doesn't invalidate the field of quantum physics as a whole. A more reasonable scientific critique is that, although eugenics did stem from legitimate scientific inquiries of its time, its assumption of genetic determinism lended itself to an oversimplified view of how traits manifested themselves. Eugenicists did not properly present not only the impact of nurture alone, but also the interplay between nature and nurture. Genes only manifest as traits when they are given a proper environment to do so. With that being said, one of the aspects that has made eugenics so pervasive is that the primary criticisms of eugenics were not scientific in nature. They were moral criticisms. There are a number of different moral concerns surrounding eugenics, but before we address the more strong criticisms, I would like to first address a common moral complaint that is pervasive but not a particularly strong complaint. The idea that the implementation of eugenics often involves a violation of the consent of the involved parties and is thereby immoral. If you take a principled stance against eugenics, then a consent-based argument can't condemn eugenics itself. It can only condemn instances where it is forced. You can still use the consent-based argument, but it isn't actually arguing against eugenics, it's arguing against coercion. But nonetheless, there are stronger arguments against eugenics than this one. Which brings us to our first moral criticism. Eugenics undermines the notion that all humans carry intrinsic value. This is more than a simple platitude, since our moral frameworks are often graded on how well they extend to all forms of human life, including those with disabilities or genetic differences. Our second moral criticism revolves around the goals of medicine. Even if it were scientifically proven that eugenics would lead to some sort of desired outcomes, the ends don't always justify the means. Using medical and genetic technology to enforce arbitrary standards of genetic fitness is a perversion of our goals for these technologies, to improve quality of life and alleviate suffering. Our third moral criticism is that eugenics perpetuates discrimination by categorizing people based on genetic traits, and we generally don't accept discrimination over immutable characteristics. That is pretty universally considered immoral. Fourthly, eugenics differs from other ideological evils like racism, sexism, and other types of superiority complexes. Something like racism is pervasive, I would argue, because it stems from innate biological differences and internal desires of pattern recognition. However, eugenics is constructed logically, ostensibly using principles of utilitarianism and science. This logical construction makes it pervasive enough that it can be annexed into these more innate superiority complexes.
Nope.
Ultimately serving as the logical bridge between deep-seated hatred and atrocities. And our final moral criticism is that eugenics represents more harm than just that which is inflicted on the vulnerable. It also perpetuates the mentality of superiority and discrimination, which represents a serious moral hazard in terms of promoting cycles of both systemic and interpersonal abuse. This leads to a degradation of social values of equality and respect, which in turn degrades our society. Eugenics is generally morally unacceptable in today's society. The harm in practices like marriage laws and compulsory sterilizations are blatantly clear. However, an astute eugenicist would point out that many things that are not necessarily nefarious arguably serve a eugenic function. For example, there are a myriad of different perspectives that need not necessarily be eugenic on both sides of this topic, but regardless of your theoretical stance on immigration laws and border policy, there is a practical necessity for a nation to have these things so as to determine things like domestic individual rights and to respect the sovereignty of other nations and other governments that we coexist with on the global stage. However, these laws also serve eugenic functions, with Madison Grant specifically arguing for restrictive immigration laws based on eugenic principles, believing that allowing unrestricted immigration would lead to the dilution and degradation of the genetic quality of the American population. Another example of laws that serve a eugenic function would be abortion laws. Personally, I am pro-choice because I think it is important to preserve and protect women's rights, but abortion could also be favored by a eugenicist because it serves a eugenic function. While a pure eugenicist's wet dream would be a study on abortion rates versus IQ, these studies are contentious and there is a general lack of credibility among them. However, some data from the Guttmacher Institute does shed light on some of these other forms of eugenics. Here they are defining the classes as follows. Poor is set to an income level of less than the federal poverty rate. Low income is set to 100 to 199% of the federal poverty rate. And upper/middle class is set to 200% of the poverty rate or higher. We can see from this graph that the approximate number of women who have had an abortion for the poor class is 42%, 26% for the low income class, and 31% for the upper/middle class. However, from this graph, we can see the poor only represent about 11% of the population, the low income group represents about 20%, and the upper/middle class represents about 68% of the population. Using this, we can construct a crude graph of the normalized rate of abortion per income level. While normalized abortion rates are not the only way of identifying representation, looking at how far that normalized abortion rate is from a value of 1 will give you an idea for the representation relative to their population. We can see here that the poor group is substantially overrepresented, the low income group is slightly overrepresented, and the upper/middle class group is substantially underrepresented. A class-based eugenicist would see no issue with these statistics. Next, let's talk about the racial eugenic data. From this graph, you can see white people make up 39% of the abortions, black people make up 29% of the abortions, Hispanic people make up 25% of the abortions, Asian or Pacific Islanders make up 6% of the abortions, and then other is 3% of abortions. And from this graph, you can see that white people make up about 58% of the population, black people make up about 12% of the population, Hispanic people make up about 18% of the population, Asian or Pacific Islanders make up about 6%, and then other is another 6%. Then finally, we can construct our normalized rate of abortion graph. As you can see, racially, we have the white and other groups underrepresented by the abortion rates, Hispanic and black people overrepresented by the abortion rates, and Asian/Pacific Islanders approximately fairly represented. A white supremacist eugenicist would be ecstatic to recite these results. It is important to note that while these results do illustrate eugenic functions, whether intentional or not, these disparities more accurately reflect a web of both genetic and complex socioeconomic factors, rather than a purely genetic determinism.
You surprised with the shake, shake, booby. If looks could kill you, would be an easier shotgun bang.
Oh! Oh, hello. I know, right? Whose balls did I have to fondle to get my very own movie? I can't tell you, but it does rhyme with pulverine.
Eugenic ideologies still exist and are perpetuated in the media landscape today. Here are a few examples.
If there are women who are seeking insemination, I would be available at this point.
JF is a YouTuber, Canadian white nationalist, and self-espoused eugenicist. JF got his PhD studying biology at the University of Montreal and went on to work as a researcher for Duke University under a grant signed by Jeffrey Epstein. I'm not kidding.
A kind of enlightened asshole who decides to fraud the system a little bit the way I did to Jeff Epstein. What? Like, I got Jeff Epstein to send me money. What? And I'm super proud of this. What? So you have to leave space for contrarian minds to make it into these systems and fuck them in the ass. What?
When JF was around 31, he famously married a 19-year-old woman who was determined by psychiatrists to have the mental capacity of a 10 or 11-year-old.
For a 32-year-old guy to do that to a 19-year-old girl?
That's called love, you idiot.
Despite being married in a different state, he went on to get engaged to Elora Patween, a different woman who was rumored to also have a cognitive impairment.
She has an actual issue.
I need to.
Don't say anything violent.
No, I want to.
What do you have to say?
No, I get seriously. You tried to kill me, okay?
Okay.
And I'm fucking sick that you're fucking me with me. You always follow me everywhere, and
All right.
and you say you want to make spiritual movement, but you fucking tried to kill me for 3 years, okay? You're fucking
Okay.
psychopath, man.
T'en as assez dit, maintenant va-t'en. Okay, so Mama JF mistakes no white guilt for someone who has committed acts of violence against her. So that's why you see her currently sad.
Admittedly, that's not really much to go off of.
What's up?
Okay, so look, everybody. Hello.
Hello?
I wanted to tell you, today I was feeling very good. I don't know why, but I feel like there's a party in my head.
I mean, we could just ask her ourselves, except she's gone missing?
Nicholas Petrus says, Mama JF, please come back. We'll see if she comes back like last time. At this point, I'm not counting on anything. And even when you get to that point, with Bitcoin reserves and everything, they will still choose to go to the city to be a crack whore. That is just what women are. They are all crack whores deep inside, and some of them can hide it for temporary amounts of time, for a specific purpose if they have a plan. Anyways, it's not even talking here specifically about Mama JF, but women in general are simply not trustable, and they constrain themselves into living in poverty, like through their own choices. And Mama JF has left me with everything that matters in life, what matters most of life. And so, what can I do? I cannot hate her. I cannot be frustrated about this. And that's it. So, that's why I had to take 3 days total to. I made so much cleaning, so much reinstalling, so much plastering of the walls, construction, renovation. What? I wanted to set the home in the way I like it. It's like sterilize this home now. I can walk finally. I can access everything. The fridge is super clean. I had bought a new fridge, a gigantic fridge, and it was too bad because I couldn't profit from this fridge because there was just too much things in it. It's like bald bat brains, little hairs from a squirrel, coniferous branches. Like Mama JF was operating this fridge like a fucking witch. But I'm back into what matters in the fridge. I like it that way. So that's it. It's also a part of the process of recovering. In your plans in life. I needed time to look at that home and see, all right, where am I headed in life?
If you want to know more about the mystery of Alora's disappearance, go check out one of the dozens of YouTube documentaries on it. Although, while JF is an interesting character, he's not actually very popular. On a more mainstream note, the movie Idiocracy is, in my opinion, effectively eugenic propaganda. To be clear, the movie is a work of comedy and shouldn't be taken too seriously, and liking the movie because you think it's funny doesn't necessarily make you a eugenicist. But while the movie may be satirical in its comedy, its core premise is in complete alignment with eugenic ideas, and the movie makes no attempt to disestablish those themes. Let's see what the Hollywood narrator has to say about the premise of the movie.
The 21st century began. Human evolution was at a turning point. Natural selection, the process by which the strongest, the smartest, the fastest reproduced in greater numbers than the rest, a process which had once favored the noblest traits of man, now began to favor different traits. Most science fiction of the day predicted a future that was more civilized and more intelligent. But as time went on, things seemed to be heading in the opposite direction, a dumbing down. How did this happen? Evolution does not necessarily reward intelligence. With no natural predators to thin the herd, it began to simply reward those who reproduced the most and left the intelligent to become an endangered species.
Okay, I get it. A movie from 2006 and an unpopular influencer don't exactly establish a trend. But those were both pure eugenic propaganda. We can see other forms of eugenic ideologies in other places too.
The government shows preference to people who have shown absolute contempt for our customs, our laws, our system itself, and they're being treated better than American citizens. Now, I know that the left and all the little gatekeepers on Twitter become literally hysterical if you use the term replacement, if you suggest that the Democratic Party is trying to replace the current electorate, the voters now casting ballots, with new people, more obedient voters from the third world. But they become hysterical because that's what's happening, actually. Let's just say it, that's true.
Maybe it's not racial. I doubt it, but maybe. Let's keep watching.
It's because of highly competent framing by the Democrats. They have framed immigration as a racial issue. So any complaint about immigration is a complaint born of racism. You're a racist if you're against it. But as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't really have that much to do with race, actually.
Phew. I thought he was going to support racially eugenic policies for explicitly racially eugenic reasons.
I mean, this is people from a bunch of different countries and cultures. Most of them are Latin, but within Latin America, anyone who's ever been there can tell you, there's a huge range of people and of subcultures. Like, it's not as simple as they pretend it is. But it really is much deeper than race. Race is a factor for some people, but underneath it all, it has to do with what kind of country you want to live in.
Yikes.
It would be kind of hard to argue against you because look at the evidence. So this matters on a bunch of different levels, but on the most basic level, it's a voting rights question. In a democracy, one person equals one vote. If you change the population, you dilute the political power of the people who live there. I mean, everyone wants to make a racial issue out of it. Ooh, the white replacement theory. No. This is a voting rights question. I have less political power because they're importing a brand new electorate. Why should I sit back and take that? The power that I have as an American guaranteed at birth is one man, one vote, and they're diluting it. No, they're not allowed to do that. Why are we putting up with this?
Surely that won't catch on.
When they let, I think the real number is 15, 16 million people into our country, when they do that, we got a lot of work to do. They're poisoning the blood of our country. They're poisoning the blood of our country. That's what they've done. They poison mental institutions and prisons all over the world. They poison mental institutions and prisons all over the world, not just in South America, not just the 3 or 4 countries that we think about, but all over the world. They're coming into our country from Africa, from Asia, all over the world. They're pouring into our country. Nobody's even looking at them. They just come in. The crime is going to be tremendous. The terrorism is going to be, and then we built a tremendous piece of the wall, and then we're going to build more.
Yikes. How we handle eugenic ideas and practices in the future, though, is up to your interpretation. There are a few future technologies that we should consider. Advances in genetic testing can lead to selective abortion of fetuses with disabilities.
They could use a genetic test to screen out for the disorder. Soon, they found out they could also screen for all kinds of common diseases.
This has prompted debates about modern eugenics, with some arguing that it allows them to ensure their children's quality of life, and with others arguing that it is merely neo-eugenics. Additionally, the potential for genetic engineering to enhance humans or eliminate perceived defects also lends itself to eugenic ideologies, raising ethical concerns.
In a document, if we suspect we've misspelled a word, we can use the find function to highlight the error and correct it or delete it. Within our DNA, that function is taken on by a system called CRISPR-Cas9. CRISPR is short for clustered, regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats. CRISPR consists of 2 components, the Cas9 protein that can cut DNA and a guide RNA that can recognize the sequence of DNA to be edited. To use CRISPR-Cas9, scientists first identify the sequence of the human genome that's causing a health problem. Then, they create a specific guide RNA to recognize that particular stretch of A's, T's, G's, and C's in the DNA. The guide RNA is attached to the DNA cutting enzyme Cas9, and then this complex is introduced to the target cells. At that point, scientists can then edit the existing genome by either modifying, deleting, or inserting new sequences. It effectively makes CRISPR-Cas9 a cut-and-paste tool for DNA editing.
Although some would argue that the material benefits of the technology outweigh the potential moral and ethical considerations, the line between therapeutic applications and enhancements can be very blurry, hinting at a potential for misuse. There is no right or wrong answer as far as whether or not the fact that these future technologies serve a eugenic function means that we ought not pursue them. At the end of the day, unless legislation is passed, it will be a value judgment that everyone must make for themselves. Eugenics was a perspective that was overly reductive, emphasizing the impact of genetics on intelligence when the environmental factors are arguably more important. However, eugenics was based on legitimate science. It wasn't completely fraudulent, nor was it entirely incorrect. These views have been pervasive for a few reasons. Firstly, the primary issues with eugenics fundamentally were moral, not scientific in nature. Secondly, eugenics isn't born from innate differences like racism. Rather, it follows from utilitarian ideas, allowing it to lend itself to other, more fundamental forms of supremacy complexes. Thirdly, not everything that can be viewed as serving a eugenic function is inherently wrong. The intentions and the outcomes matter, as is the case with immigration laws and abortion rights. While impending eugenic technologies do promise substantial benefits that warrant our genuine consideration, we should be careful not to be captured by the eugenic propaganda that exists still today, because the ideology has historically lent itself to some of the most abhorrent atrocities in human history. Or do. It's your life. I don't tell you what to do.